Going off of the FTX thing, the former CEO of FTX, Sam Bankman, was the second largest donor to Democrats this cycle. So, Hunter, I was wondering if you had any insights to what was going on there.
I don't think we want to get into politics with this call.
Restrictions on an interview. A panelist rejected on a live stream after asking Hunter Biden a political question during the podcast that centers on crypto and NFTs. But the first son is not keen on those subjects, talked about his art and recovery from addiction instead. After Hunter hopped off the chat, it seemed to drop. The call seemed to drop. The host of the roundtable admits any questions pertaining to politics his hands were forcibly tied.
There's a lot of requirements we had to meet. That was so stressful. Like usually, man, I'm very open. I ask questions, I debate. It's like a free mic. Anyone could ask any questions. But this is the first time where we were like kind of hands tied. These are the questions you ask. You can't ask any other questions. And bro, it was difficult.
Joining me now, Chris Bedford, Right Forge founding partner. Why is Hunter Biden going on a crypto NFT podcast, and why would you ever cut a deal and say, I agree not to ask political questions? That is absurdity.
Well, welcome to the life of corporate media. You're not allowed to ask any questions that are hard or really dig into what's going on. For example, with crypto. I mean, cryptocurrency is something that, just for one example, the New York Times hasn't paid much attention to at all until the NFT founder just recently, when they went at him and said, look at this guy, he's a great philanthropist, he's incredible, he's wild, he's the next big thing, he's the next Warren Buffett. Well, it turns out that one of the reasons for that maybe is because he's one of the biggest Democratic donors there possibly are. And it turns out that a lot of that money is because he was ripping people off. So it's no wonder that Hunter Biden, who I think has got some experience in this, mixing politics and money and access, didn't want to talk about that kind of subject.
Hunter Biden was on this podcast with another guy who Donald Kushner, and Kushner's business partner got upset that the podcast host went off the rails and started fussing at him about that. How dare you criticize? Essentially, how dare? I have not heard anybody thrown under the bus the way you did because of a glitch in your system that knocked Hunter and his buddy off the network so quickly. I digress. Where are the charges against Hunter Biden?
Well, right now, we pretty rarely see these kind of charges come down against people who are politically connected, particularly to the Democratic Party. I'm not exactly sure what drives that, but I would suggest that there at least has to do with the sympathies of the folks who are at the top of the Department of Justice. If it's someone who's associated with the Trump family, you're going to get local news tipped off to a suited-up raid that early in the morning where people are going to be handcuffed, even if the charges don't end up sticking. The same doesn't seem to go for the Biden family. The Bidens have tried to make this a story about addiction, and that's a very sympathetic thing. Basically, all American families have intimate relations with that, but that's not what this is about. The real story is about Hunter Biden's business dealings and the enrichment of the Biden family using access to power, access to foreign markets, access to Ukraine, access to China, potential foes of the United States. That's what this story is about. They've tried to spin it. They've done an incredible job of it. But we're talking about it here because it's all real and it's all true.
Right. Hunter Biden was lucid enough to be able to peddle the Biden family influence all around the globe year after year after year. Speaking of that, tomorrow, House Oversight Republicans, assuming that the House will the Republicans will take control of the House of Representatives. House Oversight Republicans will be holding a news conference about the investigation into the Biden family's shady business schemes. What do you expect out of that, Chris?
I expect some fireworks. I expect some things to be exposed, at least to people who are watching the correct news sources. But in general, if you're watching other networks or if you're watching some of the broadcast channels, this, you probably aren't even going to hear about this. We saw last night, for example, how many of the networks and broadcast channels decided not to carry the former president's announcement that he was running again. Mm-hmm. People pick and choose what they want to cover. They don't want to cover the attempted assassination of the Supreme Court justice. They don't want to cover this or that. It's you have to have a broad number of news sources to get any idea really what's going on with a lot of these guys. So I expect to see some fireworks. I expect to see some entertainment, but it's going to be really tough to get the actual consequences for these folks.
And Joe Biden picks and chooses what he discusses with Xi Jinping, because you saw earlier this week there was no mention of the origins of COVID. Once again, failing to stand up for the survivors and the family members of the more than 1 million Americans who died from the coronavirus. Failing to stand up to Xi Jinping and Communist China on fentanyl. Again, failing on Biden's part to stand up and show even a soupçon of empathy toward families who have lost loved ones because of fentanyl, the ingredients of which are coming from China. He likes to pick and choose.
That's the really awful thing about America's reaction to COVID. It's not just that a lot of our policymakers decided to mimic and copy China's policies and the shutdowns, which was destructive to American freedoms, lives, businesses, marriages, educations, emotional development of children, but that people decided that they wanted to blame Donald Trump for this. They wanted to make it a partisan issue. They wanted to talk about how it was Ron DeSantis' fault. That's completely ridiculous. They wanted to shut down anyone who said maybe this came from China. They wanted to shut down folks that questioned their conclusions. Of course this came from China. It was nearly obvious at the very beginning that this had something to do with the Chinese government, but they shut that down left and right, and no one's even holding Xi Jinping to account. So if he's looking at that, he says, look, I toppled the U.S. economy. I curtailed freedoms across the entire West. I knocked off President Trump, who was one of my greatest adversaries on the world stage. I put in Joe Biden, who's not even going to ask me about it. He had a pretty good year while everyone else on this planet suffered.
Right. The Biden family benefited mightily from their business dealings in communist China. And I'll say it, China virus. Chris Bedford, good to see you. China virus. That's where it came from. A proposal on who should pay for a developing nation's climate damage. And shocker, it'll impoverish the U.S. Christian Whiten joins us next.